Prisons, a social crime and failure. In 1849, Fyodor Dostoevsky wrote on the wall of his prison cell the following story of The Priest and the Devil. Quote, "Hello, you little fat father," the devil said to the priest. "What makes you lie so to those poor, misled people? What tortures of hell did you depict? Don't you know they are already suffering the tortures of hell in their earthly lives? Don't you know that you and the authorities of the state are my representatives on earth? It is you that make them suffer the pains of hell with which you threaten them. Don't you know this? Well, then, come with me." The devil grabbed the priest by the collar, lifted him high in the air, and carried him to a factory, to an iron foundry. You saw the workmen there running and hurrying to and fro, and toiling in the scorching heat. Very soon the thick, heavy air and the heat are too much for the priest. With tears in his eyes, he pleads with the devil, "Let me go. Let me leave this hell. Oh, my dear friend, I must show you many more places." The devil gets hold of him again and drags him off to a farm. There he sees workmen threshing the grain. The dust and heat are insufferable. The overseer carries a knout and unmercifully beats anyone who falls to the ground overcome by hard toil or hunger. Next, the priest is taken to the huts where these same workers live with their families, dirty, cold, smoky, ill-smelling holes. The devil grins. He points out the poverty and hardships which are at home here. "Well, isn't this enough?" he asks. And it seems as if even he, the devil, pities these people. The pious servant of God can hardly bear it. With uplifted hands he begs, "Let me go away from here. Yes, yes, this is hell on earth." "Well, then, you see. And you still promise them another hell. You torment them, torture them to death mentally when they are already all but dead physically. Come on. I will show you one more hell, one more, the very worst." He took him to a prison and showed him a dungeon, with its foul air and the many human forms, robbed of all health and energy, lying on the floor, covered with vermin that were devouring their poor, naked, emaciated bodies. "Take off your silken clothes," said the devil to the priest. "Put on your ankles heavy chains such as these unfortunates wear. Lie down on the cold and filthy floor, and then talk to them about a hell that still awaits them." "No, no," answered the priest. "I cannot think of anything more dreadful than this. I entreat you, let me go away from here." "Yes, this is hell. There can be no worse hell than this. Did you not know it? Did you not know that these men and women whom you are frightening with the picture of a hell hereafter, did you not know that they are in hell right here, before they die?" This was written 50 years ago in dark Russia, on the wall of one of the most horrible prisons. Yet who can deny that same applies with equal force to the present time, even to American prisons? With all our boasted reforms, our great social changes, and our far-reaching discoveries, human beings continue to be sent to the worst of hells, wherein they are outraged, degraded, and tortured, that society may be, quote, protected from the phantoms of its own making. Prison, a social protection? What monstrous mind ever conceived such an idea? Just as well say that health can be promoted by a widespread contagion. After 18 months of horror in an English prison, Oscar Wilde gave to the world his great masterpiece, The Ballad of Reading Gaol. The vilest deeds, like poison weeds, bloom well in prison air. It is only what is good in man that wastes and withers there. Pale anguish keeps the heavy gate, and the warder is despair. Society goes on perpetuating this poisonous air, not realizing that out of it can come naught but the most poisonous results. We are spending at the present $3.5 million per day, $1,095,000 per year to maintain prison institutions, and that in a democratic country, a sum almost as large as the combined output of wheat valued at $750 billion, and the output of coal valued at $350 billion. Professor Bushnell of Washington, D.C., estimates the cost of prisons at $6 billion annually, and Dr. G. Frank Lidston, an eminent American writer on crime, gives $5 billion annually as a reasonable figure. Such unheard of expenditure for the people of maintaining vast armies of human beings caged up like wild beasts. Yet crimes are on the increase. Thus, we learn that in America there are 4.5 times as many crimes to every million population today as there were 20 years ago. The most horrible aspect is that our national crime is murder, not robbery, embezzlement, or rape, as in the South. London is 5 times as large as Chicago, yet there are 118 murders annually in the latter city, while only 20 in London. Nor is Chicago the leading city in crime, since it is only 7th on the list, which is headed by 4 southern cities and San Francisco and Los Angeles. In view of such terrible condition of affairs, it seems ridiculous to prate of the protection society derives from its prisons. The average mind is slow in grasping the truth, but when the most thoroughly organized, centralized institution, maintained at an excessive national expense, has proven a complete social failure, the dullest must begin to question its right to exist. The time is past when we can be content with our social fabric merely because it is, quote, ordained by divine right, or by the majesty of the law. The widespread prison investigations, agitation, and education during the last few years are conclusive proof that men are learning to dig deep into the very bottom of society, down to the causes of the terrible discrepancy between social and individual life. Why, then, are prisons a social crime and a failure? To answer this vital question, it behooves us to seek the nature and cause of crimes, the methods employed in coping with them, and the effects these methods produce in ridding society of the curse and horrors of crime. First, as to the nature of crime. Havelock Ellis divides crime into 4 phases: the political, the passional, the insane, and the occasional. He says that the political crime is the victim of an attempt of a more or less despotic government to preserve its own stability. He is not necessarily guilty of an unsocial offense. He simply tries to overturn a certain political order which may itself be antisocial. This truth is recognized all over the world except in America, where the foolish notion still prevails that in a democracy there is no place for political criminals. Yet John Brown was a political criminal. So were the Chicago anarchists. So is every striker. Consequently, says Havelock Ellis, the political criminal of our time or place may be the hero, martyr, saint of another age. Lombroso calls the political criminal the true precursor of the progressive movement of humanity. Quote, the criminal by passion is usually a man of wholesome birth and honest life, who, under the stress of some great unmerited wrong, has wrought justice for himself. End quote. Mr. Hugh C. Wire, in The Menace of the Police, cites the case of Jim Flaherty, a criminal by passion who, instead of being saved by society, is turned into a drunkard and a recidivist, with a ruined and poverty-stricken family as a result. A more pathetic type is Archie, the victim in Brand Whitlock's novel The Turn of the Balance, the greatest American expose of crime in the making. Archie, even more than Flaherty, was driven to crime and death by the cruel inhumanity of his surroundings, and by the unscrupulous hounding of the machinery of the law. Archie and Flaherty are but the types of many thousands, demonstrating how the legal aspects of crime and the methods of dealing with it help to create the disease which is undermining our entire social life. Quote, the insane criminal really can no more be considered a criminal than a child, since he is mentally in the same condition as an infant or an animal. End quote. The law already recognizes that, but only in rare cases of a very flagrant nature, or when the culprit's wealth permits the luxury of criminal insanity. It has become quite fashionable to be the victim of paranoia, but on the whole the, quote, sovereignty of justice still continues to punish criminally insane with the whole severity of its power. Thus, Mr. Ellis quotes from Dr. Richter's statistics showing that in Germany 106 madmen out of the 144 criminally insane were condemned to severe punishment. The occasional criminal, quote, represents by far the largest class of our prison population, hence is the greatest menace to social well-being, end quote. What is the cause that compels a vast army of the human family to take to crime, to prefer the hideous life within prison walls to life outside? Certainly that cause must be an iron master who leaves his victims no avenue of escape, for the most depraved human being loves liberty. This terrific force is conditioned in our cruel social and economic arrangement. I do not mean to deny the biologic, physiologic, or psychologic factors in creating crime, but there is hardly an advanced criminologist who will not concede that the social and economic influences are the most relentless, the most poisonous germs of crime. Granted even that there are innate criminal tendencies, it is none the less true that these tendencies find rich nutrition in our social environment. There is close relation, says Havelock Ellis, between crimes against the person and the price of alcohol, between crimes against property and the price of wheat. He quotes Quetelet and Lacassagne, the former looking upon society as the preparer of crime, and the criminals as instruments that execute them. The latter finds that, quote, the social environment is the cultivation medium of criminality, that the criminal is the microbe, an element which only becomes important when it finds the medium which causes it to ferment. Every society has the criminals it deserves, end quote. The most, quote, prosperous industrial period makes it impossible for the worker to earn enough to keep up health and vigor. And as prosperity is, at best, an imaginary condition, thousands of people are constantly added to the host of the unemployed. From east to west, from south to north, this vast army tramps in search of work or food, and all they find is the workhouses or the slums. Those who have a spark of self-respect left prefer open defiance, prefer crime to the emaciated, degraded position of poverty. Edward Carpenter estimates that 5/6 of indictable crimes consist in some violation of property rights, but that is too low of a figure. A thorough investigation would prove that 9 crimes out of 10 could be traced, directly or indirectly, to our economic and social inequalities, to our system of remorseless exploitation and robbery. There is no criminal so stupid but recognizes this terrible fact, though he may not be able to account for it. A collection of criminal philosophy, which Havelock Ellis, Lombroso, and other eminent men have compiled, shows that the criminal feels only too keenly that it is society that drives him to crime. A Milanese thief said to Lombroso, quote, I do not rob, I merely take from the rich their superfluities. Besides, do not advocates and merchants rob? A murderer wrote, quote, knowing that 3/4 of the social virtues are cowardly vices, I thought an open assault on a rich man would be less ignoble than the cautious combination of a fraud. End quote. Another wrote, quote, I am imprisoned for stealing a half-dozen eggs. Ministers who rob millions are honored. Poor Italy. End quote. An educated convict said to Mr. David, quote, the laws of society are framed for the purpose of securing the wealth of the world to power and calculation, thereby depriving the larger portion of mankind of its rights and chances. Why should they punish me for taking by somewhat similar means from those who have taken more than they had a right to? End quote. The same man added, quote, religion robs the soul of its independence. Patriotism is the stupid worship of the world for which the well-being and the peace of the inhabitants were sacrificed by those who profit by it, while the laws of the land, in restraining natural desires, were waging war on the manifest spirit of the law of our beings. Compared with this, he concluded, thieving is an honorable pursuit. End quote. Verily, there is greater truth in this philosophy than in all the law and moral books of society. The economic, political, moral, and physical factors being the microbes of crime, how does society meet this situation? The methods of coping with crime have no doubt undergone several changes, but mainly in a theoretic sense. In practice, society has retained the primitive motive in dealing with the offender, that is, revenge. It has also adopted the theologic idea, namely punishment, while the legal and, quote, civilized methods consist of deterrence or terror and reform. we shall presently see that all four modes have failed utterly, and that we are today no nearer solution than in the Dark Ages. The natural impulse of the primitive man to strike back, to avenge a wrong, is out of date. Instead, the civilized man, stripped of courage and daring, has delegated to an organized machinery the duty of avenging his wrongs, in the foolish belief that the state is justified in doing what he no longer has the manhood or consistency to do. The, quote, majesty of the law is a reasoning thing. It would not stoop to primitive instincts. Its mission is of a, quote, higher nature. True, it is still steeped in the theologic muddle which proclaims punishment as a means of purification or the vicarious atonement of sin. But legally and socially, the statute exercises punishment, not merely as an infliction of pain upon the offender, but also for its terrifying effect upon others. What is the real basis of punishment, however? The notion of a free will, the idea that man is at all times a free agent for good or evil. If he chooses the latter, he must be made to pay the price. Although this theory has long been exploded and thrown upon the dust heap, it continues to be applied daily by the entire machinery of government, turning it into the most cruel and brutal tormentor of human life. The only reason for its continuance is the still more cruel notion that the greater the terror punishment spreads, the more certain its preventative effect. Society is using the most drastic methods in dealing with the social offender. Why do they not deter? Although in America a man is supposed to be considered innocent until proven guilty, the instruments of law, the police, carry on a reign of terror, making indiscriminate arrests, beating, clubbing, bullying people, using the barbarous methods of the, quote, third degree, subjecting their unfortunate victims to the foul air of the station house and the still fouler language of its guardians. Yet crimes are rapidly multiplying, and society is paying the price. On the other hand, it is an open secret that when the unfortunate citizen has been given the full, quote, mercy of the law, and for the sake of safety is hidden in the worst of hells, his real Calvary begins. Robbed of his rights as a human being, degraded to a mere automaton, without will or feeling, dependent entirely upon the mercy of brutal keepers, he daily goes through a process of dehumanization, compared with which savage revenge was mere child's play. There is not a single penal institution or reformatory in the United States where men are not tortured, quote, to be made good, by means of the blackjack, the club, the straitjacket, the water cure, the, quote, hummingbird, an electrical contrivance running along the human body, the solitary, the bull ring, and starvation diet. In these institutions his will is broken, his soul degraded, his spirit subdued by the deadly monotony and routine of prison life. In Ohio, Illinois, Pennsylvania, Missouri, and in the South, these horrors have become so flagrant as to reach the outside world, while in most other prisons the same Christian methods still prevail. But prison walls rarely allow the agonized shrieks of the victims to escape. Prison walls are thick, they dull the sound. Society might with greater immunity abolish all prisons at once, than to hope for protection from these 20th century chambers of horrors. Year after year the gates of prison hells return to the world an emaciated, deformed, will-less, shipwrecked crew of humanity, with the Cain mark on their foreheads, their hopes crushed, all their natural inclination thwarted. With nothing but hunger and inhumanity to greet them, these victims soon sink back into crime as the only possibility of existence. It is not at all an unusual thing to find men and women who have spent half their lives, nay, almost their entire existence, in prison. I know a woman on Blackwell's Island who had been in and out 38 times, and through a friend I learned that a young boy of 17, whom he had nursed and cared for in the Pittsburgh penitentiary, had never known the meaning of liberty. From the reformatory to the penitentiary had been the path of this boy's life, until, broken in body, he died a victim of social revenge. These personal experiences are substantiated by extensive data giving overwhelming proof of the utter futility of prisons as a means of deterrence or reform. Well-meaning persons are now working for a new departure in the prison question, reclamation, to restore once more to the prisoner the possibility of becoming a human being. Commendable as this is, I fear it is impossible to hope for good results from pouring good wine into a musty bottle. Nothing short of a complete reconstruction of society will deliver mankind from the cancer of crime. Still, if the dull edge of our social conscience would be sharpened, the penal institutions might be given a new coat of varnish. But the first step to be taken is the renovation of the social consciousness, which is in a rather dilapidated condition. It is sadly in need to be awakened to the fact that crime is a question of degree, that we all have the rudiments of crime in us, more or less, according to our mental, physical, and social environment, and that the individual criminal is merely a reflex of the tendencies of the aggregate. With the social consciousness wakened, the average individual may learn to refuse the, quote, honor of being the bloodhound of the law. He may cease to persecute, despise, and mistrust the social offender, and give him a chance to live and breathe among his fellows. Institutions are, of course, harder to reach. They are cold, impenetrable, and cruel. Still, with the social consciousness quickened, it might be possible to free the prison victims from the brutality of prison officials, guards, and keepers. Public opinion is a powerful weapon. Keepers of human prey, even, are afraid of it. They may be taught a little humanity, especially if they realize that their jobs depend on it. But the most important step is to demand for the prisoner the right to work while in prison, with some momentary recompense that would enable him to lay aside a little for the day of his release, the beginning of a new life. It is almost ridiculous to hope much from present society when we consider that working men, wage slaves themselves, object to convict labor. I shall not go into the cruelty of this objection, but merely consider the impracticality of it. To begin with, the opposition so far raised by organized labor has been directed against windmills. Prisoners have always worked. Only the state has been their exploiter, even as the individual employer has been the robber of organized labor. The states have either set the convicts to work for the government, or they have farmed convict labor to private individuals. 29 of the states pursue this latter plan. The federal government and 17 states have discarded it, as have the leading nations of Europe, since it leads to hideous overworking and abuse of prisoners, and to endless graft. Quote, Rhode Island, the state dominated by Aldrich, offers perhaps the worst example. Under a 5-year contract dated July 7, 1906, and renewable for 5 years more at the option of private contractors, the labor of the inmates of the Rhode Island Penitentiary and the Providence County Jail is sold to the Reliance Sterling MFG Company at the rate of a trifle less than 25 cents a day per man. This company is really a gigantic prison labor trust, for it also leases the convict labor of Connecticut, Michigan, Indiana, Nebraska, and South Dakota penitentiaries, and the reformatories of New Jersey, Indiana, Illinois, and Wisconsin, 11 establishments in all. Quote, the enormity of the graft under the Rhode Island contract may be estimated from the fact that this same company pays 62.5 cents a day in Nebraska for the convict's labor, and that Tennessee, for example, gets $1.10 a day for a convict's work from the Gray Dudley Hardware Company. Missouri gets 70 cents a day from the Star Overall MFG Company. West Virginia gets 65 cents a day from the Kraft MFG Company, and Maryland 55 cents a day from Oppenheim, Oberndorf and Company, shirt manufacturers. The very difference in prices points to enormous graft. For example, the Reliance Sterling MFG Company manufactures shirts, the cost by free labor not being less than $1.20 per dozen, while it pays Rhode Island 30 cents a dozen. Furthermore, the state charges this trust no rent for the use of its huge factory, charges nothing for power, heat, light, or even drainage, and exacts no taxes. What graft? End quote. It is estimated that more than $12 million is worth of working men's shirts and overalls is produced annually in this country by prison labor. It is a women's industry, and the first reflection that arises is that immense amount of free female labor is thus displaced. The second consideration is that male convicts, who should be learning trades that would give them some chance of keeping self-supporting after their release, are kept at this work at which they cannot possibly make a dollar. This is the more serious when we consider that much of this labor is done in reformatories, which so loudly profess to be training their inmates to become useful citizens. The third, and most important, consideration is that the enormous profits thus run from convict labor are a constant incentive to the contractors to exact from their unhappy victims tasks altogether beyond their strength, and to punish them cruelly when their work does not come up to the excessive demands made. Another word on the condemnation of convicts to tasks at which they cannot hope to make a living after release. Indiana, for example, is a state that has made a great splurge over being in the front rank of modern penological improvements. Yet, according to the report rendered in 1908 by the training school of its, quote, reformatory, 135 were engaged in the manufacture of chains, 207 in that of shirts, and 255 in the foundry, a total of 597 in 3 occupations. But at this so-called reformatory, 59 occupations were represented by the inmates, 39 of which were connected with country pursuits. Indiana, like other states, professes to be training the inmates of her reformatory to occupations by which they will be able to make their living when released. She actually sets them to work making chains, shirts, and brooms, the latter for the benefit of the Louisville Fancy Grocery Company. Broom making is a trade largely monopolized by the blind. Shirt making is done by women, and there is only one free chain factory in the state, and at that, a released convict cannot hope to get employment. The whole thing is a cruel farce. If, then, the states can be instrumental in robbing their helpless victims of such tremendous profits, it not high time for organized labor to stop its idle howl, and to insist on decent remuneration for the convict, even as labor organizations claim for themselves? In that way, working men would kill the germ which makes of the prisoner an enemy to the interests of labor. I have said elsewhere that thousands of convicts, incompetent and without a trade, without means of subsistence, are yearly turned back into the social fold. These men and women must live, for even an ex-convict has needs. Prison life has made them antisocial beings, and the rigidly closed doors that meet them on their release are not likely to decrease their bitterness. The inevitable result is that they form a favorable nucleus out of which scabs, blacklegs, detectives, and policemen are drawn, only too willing to do the master's bidding. Thus organized labor, by its foolish opposition to work in prison, defeats its own ends. It helps to create poisonous fumes that stifle every attempt for economic betterment. If the working man wants to avoid these effects, he should insist on the right of the convict to work. He should meet him as a brother, take him into his organization, and with his aid turn against the system which grinds them both. Last, but not least, is a growing realization of the barbarity and the inadequacy of the definite sentence. Those who believe in and earnestly aim at a change are fast coming to the conclusion that man must be given an opportunity to make good. And how is he to do it with 10, 15, or 20 years imprisonment before him? The hope of liberty and of opportunity is the only incentive to life, especially the prisoner's life. Society has sinned so long against him, it ought to at least to leave him that. I am not very sanguine that it will, or that any real change in that direction can take place under the conditions that breed both the prisoner and the jailer will forever be abolished. Out of his mouth a red, red rose, out of his heart a white. For who can say by what strange way Christ brings his will to light? since the barren staff the pilgrim bore bloomed in the great Pope's sight. Patriotism, a menace to liberty. What is patriotism? Is it a love of one's birthplace, the place of childhood's recollections and hopes, dreams and aspirations? Is it the place where, in childlike naivety, we would watch the fleeting clouds and wonder why we, too, could not run so swiftly? The place where we would count the myriad glittering stars, terror-stricken lest each one, quote, "an eye should be," end quote, piercing the very depths of our little souls? Is it the place where we would listen to the music of the birds, and long to have wings to fly, even as they, to distant lands? Or the place where we would sit at mother's knee, enraptured by wonderful tales of great deeds and conquests? In short, is it love for the spot, every inch representing dear and precious recollections of a happy, joyous, and playful childhood? If that were patriotism, few American men of today could be called upon to be patriotic, since the place of play has been turned into factory, mill, and mine, while deafening sounds of machinery have replaced the music of the birds. Nor can we no longer hear the tales of great deeds, for the stories our mothers tell today are but those of sorrow, tears, and grief. What then is patriotism? Quote, "Patriotism, sir, is the last resort of scoundrels," said Dr. Johnson. Leo Tolstoy, the greatest anti-patriot of our times, defines patriotism as a principle that will justify the training of wholesale murderers, a trade that requires better equipment for the exercise of man-killing than the making of such necessities of life as shoes, clothing, and houses, a trade that guarantees better returns and greater glory than that of the average working man. Gustav Hervé, another great anti-patriot, justly calls patriotism a superstition, one far more injurious, brutal, and inhumane than religion. The superposition of religion originated in man's inability to explain natural phenomena. That is, when primitive man heard thunder or saw the lightning, he could not account for either, and therefore concluded that back of them must be a force greater than himself. Similarly, he was a supernatural force in the rain, and in the various other changes in nature. Patriotism, on the other hand, is a superstition artificially created and maintained through a network of lies and falsehoods, a superstition that robs man of his self-respect and dignity, and increases his arrogance and conceit. Indeed, conceit, arrogance, and egotism are the essentials of patriotism. Let me illustrate. Patriotism assumes that our globe is divided into little spots, each one surrounded by an iron gate. Those who have had the fortune of being born in some particular spot consider themselves better, nobler, grander, more intelligent than the living beings inhabiting any other spot. It is, therefore, the duty of everyone living on that chosen spot to fight, kill, and die in the attempt to impose his superiority upon all the others. The inhabitants of the other spots reason in the like manner, of course, with the result that, from early infancy, the mind of the child is poisoned with blood-curdling stories about the Germans, the French, the Italians, Russians, etc. When the child has reached manhood, he is thoroughly saturated with the belief that he is chosen by the Lord himself to defend his country against the attack or invasion of any foreigner. It is for that purpose that we are clamoring for a greater army and navy, more battleships and ammunition. It is for that purpose that America has within a short time spent $400 million. Just think of it, $400 million taken from the produce of the people. For surely it is not the rich who contribute to patriotism. They are cosmopolitans, perfectly at home in every land. We in America know well the truth of this. Are not our rich Americans Frenchmen in France, Germans in Germany, or Englishmen in England? And do they not squander with cosmopolitan grace fortunes coined by American factory children and cotton slaves? Yes, there is a patriotism that will make it possible to send messages of condolence to a despot like the Russian Tsar, when any mishap befalls him, as President Roosevelt did in the name of his people, when Sergius was punished by the Russian revolutionists. It is a patriotism that we will assist the arch-murderer, Diaz, in destroying thousands of lives in Mexico, or that will even aid in arresting Mexican revolutionists on American soil and keep them incarcerated in American prisons without the slightest cause or reason. But then, patriotism is not for those who represent wealth and power. It is good enough for the people. It reminds one of the historic wisdom of Frederick the Great, the bosom friend of Voltaire, who said, quote, "Religion is a fraud, but it must be maintained for the masses." That patriotism is rather a comfy institution. No one will doubt after considering the following statistics. The progressive increase of the expenditures for the leading armies and navies of the world during the last quarter of a century is a fact of such gravity as to startle every thoughtful student of economic problems. It may be briefly indicated by dividing the time from 1881 to 1905 into 5-year periods, and Army and Navy purposes during the first and last of those periods. From the first to the last of the periods noted, the expenditures of Great Britain increased from 2,101,848,936 to $4,143,226,885. Those of France from $3,324,500,000 to $3,455,109,900. Those of Germany from $725,200,000 to $2,700,375,600. Those of the United States from $1,275,500,750 to $2,650,900,450. Those of Russia from $1,900,975,500 to $5,250,445,100. Those of Italy from $1,600,975,750 to $1,755,500,100. And those of Japan from $182,900,500 to $700,925,475. The military expenditures of each of the nations mentioned increased in each of the 5-year periods under review. During the entire interval from 1881 to 1905, Great Britain's outlay for her army increased fourfold. That of the United States was tripled. Russia's was doubled. That of Germany increased 35%, that of France about 15%, and that of Japan nearly 500%. If we compare the expenditures of these nations upon their armies with their total expenditures for all the 25 years ending with 1905, the proportion rose as follows. In Great Britain, from 20% to 37%. In the United States, from 15 to 23%. In France, from 16 to 18%. In Italy, from 12 to 15%. In Japan, from 12 to 14%. On the other hand, it is interesting to note that the proportion of Germany decreased from about 58% to 25%. The decrease being due to the enormous increase in the imperial expenditures for other purposes, the fact being that the army expenditures for the period of 1901 through 05 were higher than for any 5-year period preceding. Statistics show that the countries in which army expenditures are greatest in proportion to the total national revenues are Great Britain, United States, Japan, France, and Italy, in the order named. The showing as to the cost of great navies is equally impressive. During the 25 years ending with 1905, naval expenditures increased approximately as follows: Great Britain 300%, France 60%, Germany 600%, the United States 525%, Russia 300%, Italy 250%, and Japan 700%. With the exception of Great Britain, the United States spends more for naval purposes than any other nation, and this expenditure bears also a larger proportion to the entire national disbursements than that of any other power. In the period 1881 through 85, the expenditure for the United States Navy was $6.20 out of each $100 apportioned for all national purposes. The amount rose to $6.60 for the next 5-year period, to $8.10 for the next, to $11.70 for the next, and to $16.40 for 1901 through 05. It is morally certain that the outlay for the current period of 5 years will show a still further increase. The rising cost of militarism may be still further illustrated by computing it as a per capita tax on population. From the first to the last of the 5-year periods taken as the basis for the comparisons here given, it has risen as follows. In Great Britain, from $18.47 to $52.50. In France, from $19.66 to $23.62. In Germany, from $10.17 to $15.51. In the United States, from $5.62 to $13.64. In Russia, from $6.14 to $8.37. In Italy, from $9.59 to $11.24. And in Japan, from 86 cents to $3.11. It is in connection with this rough estimate of cost per capita that the economic burden of militarism is most appreciable. The irresistible conclusion from available data is that the increase of expenditure for Army and Navy purposes is rapidly surpassing the growth of population in each of the countries considered in the present calculation. In other words, a continuation of the increased demands of militarism threatens each of those nations with a progressive exhaustion both of men and resources. The awful waste that patriotism necessitates ought to be sufficient to cure the man of even average intelligence from this disease. Yet patriotism demands still more. The people are urged to be patriotic, and for the luxuries they pay, not only by supporting their, quote, defenders, but even by sacrificing their own children. Patriotism requires allegiance to the flag, which means obedience and readiness to kill father, mother, brother, sister. The usual contention is that we need a standing army to protect the country from foreign invasion. Every intelligent man and woman knows, however, that this is a myth maintained to frighten and coerce the foolish. The governments of the world, knowing each other's interests, do not invade each other. They have learned that they can gain much more by international arbitration of disputes than by war and conquest. Indeed, as Carl says, war is a quarrel between two thieves too cowardly to fight their own battle. Therefore, they take boys from one village and another village, stick them into uniforms, equip them with guns, and let them loose like wild beasts against each other. End quote. It does not require much wisdom to trace every war back to a similar cause. Let us take our own Spanish-American War, supposedly a great and patriotic event in the history of the United States. How our hearts burned with indignation against the atrocious Spaniards. True, our indignation did not flare up spontaneously. It was nurtured by months of newspaper agitation, and long after Butcher Whaler had killed off many noble Cubans and outraged many Cuban women. Still, in justice to the American nation be it said, it did grow indignant and was willing to fight, and that it fought bravely. But when the smoke was over, the dead buried, and the cost of the war came back to the people in an increase in the price of commodities and rent, that is, when we sobered up from our patriotic spree, it suddenly dawned on us that the cause of the Spanish-American War was the consideration of the price of sugar, or, to be more explicit, that the lives, blood, and money of the American people were used to protect the interests of American capitalists, which were threatened by the Spanish government. That this is not an exaggeration, but is based on absolute facts and figures, is best proven by the attitude of the American government to Cuban labor. When Cuba was firmly in the clutches of the United States, the very soldiers sent to liberate Cuba were ordered to shoot Cuban working men during the Great Cigar Makers' Strike, which took place shortly after the war. Nor do we stand alone in waging war for such causes. The curtain is beginning to be lifted on the motives of the terrible Russo-Japanese War, which cost so much blood and tears. And we see again that back of the fierce Moloch of war stands the still fiercer god of commercialism. Kuropatkin, the Russian Minister of War during the Russo-Japanese struggle, has revealed the true secret behind the latter. The Tsar and his Grand Dukes, having invested money in Korean concessions, the war was forced for the sole purpose of speedily accumulating large fortunes. The contention that a standing army and navy is the best security of peace is about as logical as the claim that the most peaceful citizen is he who goes about heavily armed. The experience of everyday life fully proves that the armed individual is invariably anxious to try his strength. The same is historically true of governments. Really peaceful countries do not waste life and energy in war preparations, with the result that peace is maintained. However, the clamor for an increased army and navy is not due to any foreign danger. It is owing to the dread of the growing discontent of the masses and of the international spirit among the workers. It is to meet the internal enemy that the powers of various countries are preparing themselves, an enemy who, once awakened to consciousness, will prove more dangerous than any foreign invader. The powers that have for centuries been engaged in enslaving the masses have made a thorough study of their psychology. They know that the people at large are like children whose despair, sorrow, and tears can be turned into joy with a little toy. And the more gorgeously the toy is dressed, the louder the colors, the more it will appeal to the million-headed child. An army and navy represents the people's toys. To make them more attractive and acceptable, hundreds and thousands of dollars are being spent for the display of these toys. That was the purpose of the American government in equipping a fleet and sending it along the Pacific coast, that every American citizen should be made to feel the pride and glory of the United States. The city of San Francisco spent $100,000 for the entertainment of the fleet. Los Angeles, $60,000. Seattle and Tacoma, about $100,000. To entertain the fleet, did I say? To dine and wine a few superior officers, while the, quote, brave boys had to mutiny to get sufficient food. Yes, $260,000 were spent on fireworks, theater parties, and revelries, at a time when men, women, and children through the breadth and length of the country were starving in the streets, when thousands of unemployed were ready to sell their labor at any price. $260,000. What could not have been accomplished with such an enormous sum? But instead of bread and shelter, the children of those cities were taken to see the fleet, that it may remain, as one of the newspapers said, quote, a lasting memory for the child. A wonderful thing to remember, is it not? The implements of civilized slaughter. If the mind of the child is to be poisoned with such memories, what hope is there for a true realization of human brotherhood? We Americans claim to be a peace-loving people. We hate bloodshed. We are opposed to violence. Yet we go into spasms of joy over the possibilities of projecting dynamite bombs from flying machines upon helpless citizens. We are ready to hang, electrocute, or lynch anyone who, from economic necessity, will risk his own life in the attempt upon that of some industrial magnate. Yet our hearts swell with pride at the thought that America is becoming the most powerful nation on earth, and that it will eventually plant her iron foot on the necks of all other nations. Such is the logic of patriotism. Considering the evil results that patriotism is fraught with for the average man, it is as nothing compared with the insult and injury that patriotism heaps upon the soldier himself, that poor, deluded victim of superstition and ignorance. He, the savior of his country, the protector of his nation, what has patriotism in store for him? A life of slavish submission, vice, and perversion. During peace, a life of danger, exposure, and death during war. While on a recent lecture tour in San Francisco, I visited the Presidio, the most beautiful spot overlooking the bay in Golden Gate Park. Its purpose should have been playgrounds for children, gardens, and music for the recreation of the weary. Instead, it is made ugly, dull, and gray by barracks wherein the rich would not allow their dogs to dwell. In these miserable shanties, soldiers are herded like cattle. Here they waste their young days polishing the boots and brass buttons of their superior officers. Here, too, I saw the distinction of classes. Sturdy sons of a free republic drawn up in line like convicts, saluting every passing shrimp of a lieutenant. American equality, degrading manhood and elevating the uniform. Barrack life further tends to develop tendencies of sexual perversion. It is gradually producing along this line results similar to European military conditions. Havelock Ellis, the noted writer on sex psychology, has made a thorough study of the subject. I quote, "Some of the barracks are great centers of male prostitution. The number of soldiers who prostitute themselves is greater than we are willing to believe. It is no exaggeration to say that in certain regiments the presumption is in favor of the venality of the majority of the men. On summer evenings, Hyde Park and the neighborhood of Albert Gate are full of guardsmen and others playing a lively trade, and with little disguise, in uniform or out. In most cases, the proceeds form a comfortable addition to Tommy Atkins' pocket money." End quote. To what extent this perversion has eaten its way into the Army and Navy can best be judged from the fact that special houses exist for this form of prostitution. The practice is not limited to England. It is universal. Quote, "Soldiers are no less sought after in France than in England or in Germany, and special houses for military prostitution exist both in Paris and the garrison towns." End quote. Had Mr. Havelock Ellis included America in his investigation of sex perversion, he would have found that the same conditions prevail in our Army and Navy as in those of other countries. The growth of the standing army inevitably adds to the spread of sex perversion. The barracks are the incubators. Aside from the sexual effects of barrack life, it also tends to unfit the soldier for useful labor after leaving the army. Men skilled in a trade seldom enter the army or navy, but even they, after a military experience, find themselves totally unfitted for their former occupations. Having acquired habits of idleness and a taste for excitement and adventure, no peaceful pursuit can content them. Released from the army, they can turn to no useful work. But it is usually the social riffraff, discharged prisoners, and the like, whom either the struggle for life or their own inclination drives into the ranks. These, their military term over, again turn to their former life of crime, more brutalized and degraded than before. It is a well-known fact that in our prisons there is a goodly number of ex-soldiers, while, on the other hand, the Army and Navy are to a great extent supplied with ex-convicts. Of all the evil results I have just described, none seem to me so detrimental to human integrity as the spirit patriotism has produced in the case of Private William Buvalda. Because he foolishly believed that one can be a soldier and exercise his rights as a man at the same time, the military authorities punished him severely. True, he had served his country 15 years, during which time his record was unimpeachable. According to General Funston, who reduced Buwalda's sentence to 3 years, quote, "The first duty of an officer or an enlisted man is unquestioned obedience and loyalty to the government, and it makes no difference whether he approves of that government or not." End quote. Thus Funston stamps the true character of allegiance. According to him, the entrance into the army abrogates the principles of the Declaration of Independence. What a strange development of patriotism that turns a thinking being into a loyal machine! In justification of the most outrageous sentence of Buvalda, General Funston tells the American people that the soldier's action was, quote, "a serious crime equal to treason," end quote. Now, what did this, quote, terrible crime really consist of? Simply in this. William Buvalda was one of 1,500 people who attended a public meeting in San Francisco, and, oh, horrors, he shook hands with the speaker, Emma Goldman. A terrible crime indeed, which the general calls, quote, "a great military offense, infinitely worse than desertion." Can there be a greater indictment against patriotism than that it will thus brand a man a criminal, throw him into prison, and rob him of the results of 15 years of faithful service? Buvalda gave to his country the best years of his life and his very manhood, but all that was as nothing. Patriotism is inexorable and, like all insatiable monsters, demands all or nothing. It does not admit that a soldier is also a human being, who has a right to his own feelings and opinions, his own inclinations and ideas. No, patriotism cannot admit of that. That is the lesson which Buvalda was made to learn at a rather costly, though not at a useless price. When he returned to freedom, he had lost his position in the army, but he regained his self-respect. After all, that is worth 3 years of imprisonment. A writer on the military conditions of America, in a recent article, commented on the power of the military man over the civilian in Germany. He said, among other things, that if our republic had no other meaning than to guarantee all citizens equal rights, it would have just cause for existence. I am convinced that the writer was not in Colorado during the patriotic regime of General Bell. He probably would have changed his mind had he seen how, in the name of patriotism and the republic, men were thrown into bullpens, dragged about, driven across the border, and subjected to all kinds of indignities. Nor is that Colorado incident the only one in the growth of military power in the United States. There is hardly a strike where troops and militia do not come to the rescue of those in power, and where they do not act as arrogantly and brutally as they do the men wearing the Kaiser's uniform. Then, too, we have the Dick military law. Had the writer forgotten that? A great misfortune with most of our writers is that they are absolutely ignorant on current events, or that, lacking honesty, they will not speak of these matters. And so it has come to pass that the Dick military law was rushed through Congress with little discussion and little less publicity. A law which gives the president the power to turn a peaceful citizen into a bloodthirsty man-killer, supposedly for the defense of the country, in reality for the protection of the interests of that particular party whose mouthpiece the president happens to be. Our writer claims that militarism can never become such a power in America as abroad, since it is voluntary with us while compulsory in the old world. Two very important facts, however, the gentleman forgets to consider. First, that conscription has created in Europe a deep-seated hatred of militarism among all classes of society. Thousands of young recruits enlist under protest, and, once in the army, they will use every possible means to desert. Second, that it is the compulsory feature of militarism which has created a tremendous anti-militarist movement, feared by European powers far more than anything else. After all, the great bulwark of capitalism is militarism. The very moment the latter is undermined, capitalism will totter. True, we have no conscription, that is, men are not usually forced to enlist in the army, but we have developed a far more exacting and rigid force, necessity. Is it not a fact that during industrial depressions there is a tremendous increase in the number of enlistments? The trade of militarism may not be either lucrative or honorable, but it is better than tramping the country in search of work, standing in the bread line, or sleeping in municipal lodging houses. After all, it means $13 per month, 3 meals a day, and a place to sleep. Yet even necessity is not sufficiently strong a factor to bring into the army an element of character and manhood. No wonder our military authorities complain of the, quote, poor material enlisting in the army and navy. This admission is a very encouraging sign. It proves that there is still enough of the spirit of independence and love of liberty left in the average American to risk starvation rather than don the uniform. Thinking men and women the world over are beginning to realize that patriotism is too narrow and limited a conception to meet the necessities of our time. The centralization of power has brought into being an international feeling of solidarity among the oppressed nations of the world, a solidarity which represents a greater harmony of interest between the working man of America and his brothers abroad than between the American miner and his exploiting compatriot. A solidarity which fears not foreign invasion, because it is bringing all the workers to the point when they will say to their masters, quote, "Go and do your own killing. We have done it long enough for you." End quote. This solidarity is awakening the consciousness of even the soldiers, they, too, being flesh of the great human family. A solidarity that has proven infallible more than once during past struggles, and which has been the impetus inducing the Parisian soldiers during the Commune of 1871 to refuse to obey when ordered to shoot their brothers. It has given courage to the men who mutinied on Russian warships during recent years. It will eventually bring about the uprising of all the oppressed and downtrodden against their international exploiters. The proletariat of Europe has realized the great force of that solidarity and has, as a result, inaugurated a war against patriotism and its bloody specter, militarism. Thousands of men fill the prisons of France, Germany, Russia, and the Scandinavian countries because they dared to defy the ancient superstition. Nor is the movement limited to the working class. It has embraced representatives in all stations of life, its chief exponents being men and women prominent in art, science, and letters. America will have to follow suit. The spirit of militarism has already permeated all walks of life. Indeed, I am convinced that militarism is growing a greater danger here than anywhere else, because of the many bribes capitalism holds out to those whom it wishes to destroy. The beginning has already been made in the schools. Evidently, the government holds to the Jesuitical conception, quote, "Give me the child mine, and I will mold the man," end quote. Children are trained in military tactics, the glory of military achievements extolled in the curriculum, and the youthful minds perverted to suit the government. Further, the youth of the country is appealed to in glaring posters to join the army and navy, quote, "A fine chance to see the world," end quote, cries the governmental huckster. Thus innocent boys are morally shanghaied into patriotism, and the military Moloch strides conquering through the nation. The American working man has suffered so much at the hands of the soldier, state and federal, that he is quite justified in his disgust with, and his opposition to, the uniformed parasite. However, mere denunciation will not solve this great problem. What we need is a propaganda of education for the soldier, anti-patriotic literature that will enlighten him as to the real horrors of his trade, and that will awaken his consciousness to his true relation to the man to whose labor he owes his very existence. It is precisely this that the authorities fear most. It is already high treason for a soldier to attend a radical meeting. No doubt they will also stamp it high treason for a soldier to read a radical pamphlet. But then, has not authority from time immemorial stamped every step of progress as treasonable? Those, however, who earnestly strive for social reconstruction can well afford to face all that, for it is probably even more important to carry the truth into the barracks than into the factory. When we have undermined the patriotic lie, we shall have cleared the path for the great structure wherein all nationalities shall be united into a universal brotherhood, a truly free society.